The Admin and Finance Committee, if you'd have your seats, please. Roll call.
Dr. Beebe.
Present.
Dr. Beebe is present. Ms. Bofi.
Here.
Ms. Bofi is present. Ms. Bradford. Ms. Bradford is not present. Mr. Garvey.
Here.
Mr. Garvey is present. Mr. Gio.
Present.
Mr. Gio is present. Ms. Hill.
Present.
Ms. Hill is present. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee is not present. Dr. Moranti.
Present.
Dr. Moranti is present. Ms. Orange Jones.
Present.
Ms. Orange Jones is present. Mr. Romer.
Here.
Mr. Romer is present. Ms. Smith.
Here.
Ms. Smith is present. You have a quorum.
Thank you for the roll call. First item.
The consent agenda is ready for approval, adding items 4.1 and 5.3.
Thank you.
What is that?
Looks like they have comment.
So we have some comment cards on some of the consent agenda items, so we'll have to pull those items. We'll get that sorted out here in a minute.
Okay. We will be pulling items 2.1, 2.2, 2.4, and 3.2 from the consent agenda due to public comment, and still adding 4.1 and 5.3.
So can I have a motion on the consent agenda to accept 2.3, 3.1, 4.1, and 5.3?
So move.
Ms. Smith, a second. Ms. Jones, any discussion on that item? Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
The item 2.1, consideration of a report from the LD Director of Internal Audit.
Do I have a motion to accept the report? Ms.
Second.
Jones, second. Ms. Bofi. We have public comment on that. If you would, go ahead, I'm sorry.
We don't need to make comments unless
Yeah,
the board
no.
has questions.
Yeah, so if you just be prepared, and if there are questions, we'll ask. Thank you for coming up. Ms. Berrios?
Lee Berrios, retired teacher, St. Tammany. I just got in, so I'm trying to organize my notes, but I did write down a comment that 2010 is the last posted report to the website, and I just wonder why we can't get more current update on these reports so the public is aware of what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
On page 2, item 2.2, consideration of LDE contracts of $50,000 and under approved by the State Superintendent of Education. The recommendation is to receive.
Do we have a motion to receive?
Motion.
Ms. Jones, second. Mr. Romer? Any discussion from the board on the item? Ms. Berrios? Item 2.2.
Lee Berrios, St. Tammany. Again, I'm looking at my notes real quickly. I'm just concerned that, or I question, all the expenses for the teacher leaders, which add up to, and now I don't see my amount, $115,000 approximately. I would just wonder why we couldn't have a multi-parish online sort of interactive classes where we're so big on technology and we've developed that so much that would actually be more efficient rather than having 64 teachers each cover an entire district. That it wouldn't be more efficient to have these online classes for teachers and probably cut that expense. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Any objection to the motion?
I'd like
Ms. Bophy?
I'd like to make a motion to commend, or not a motion, but just a comment to commend the department on using the capabilities and the interest of our local teachers. And I know that, one, having them work together is going to further develop their capacity, but two, really looking within our state to find opportunities to get the things that we need. And so I think it's exciting to read through these pages of the names of all of our talented teachers. So I appreciate the work you're doing to tap that expertise.
Thank you. I'll use this opportunity to just pick up Ms. Bophy on what you had to say. The teacher leaders are they're some of the state's finest public servants and educators, and it's not controversial. It's not big name stuff. It'll never make the front pages of the newspapers, but they are probably the most innovative group of educators that I've ever worked with, and I hope that we get a chance to meet them more formally as a board. So my thanks for the comments, Ms. Bophy, and I'll pass that along to them.
Thank you for your input. Any further discussion? Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
On page 90, item 2.4, consideration of in-state travel for board members to be reimbursed from the BESE budget. The recommendation is to receive.
Do I have a motion to receive? Ms. Smith, second. Dr. Moranti. Any discussion on the board on this item?
I just want to point out that with reference to the reporting of BESE travel, that there may be some individuals when they review our travel expenses that they may think that we don't go to those events within our districts. And I just want the audience to be aware that while I do travel, I travel at my own expense, and I just wanted that to be offered as part of record.
Okay, thank you for your comments.
My expand on that, I do want people to know these doesn't necessarily represent all the travel that members do. This happens to be generally travel outside of their own districts for purposes of their capacity. So I appreciate Dr. Beebe's comments.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Romer. Ms. Berrios?
Lee Barrios, retired teacher. I don't know, it seems like I have an obvious question about this. I see Mr. Lee's request for reimbursement there, and according to the newspaper, Mr. Romer stated that he wouldn't be considering those until the situation with Mr. Lee was settled, and I wondered what the status of that, why there really isn't any discussion, and why those are up there for approval from BESE with this ongoing problem.
This is not approval. I appreciate your comments. Mr. Lee's reimbursements have been suspended until clarification. This is a report of what's been submitted, and I don't know if these particular ones came in before or after the audit. So I think they came in before, but just for clarification, those have been suspended until that is resolved.
Okay, thank you.
Any further discussion? Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
On page 99, item 3.2, consideration of ratification of the board president's submission of required legislative reports to the Louisiana legislature. The recommendation is to ratify.
So moved.
Ms. Bophy moved. Second? Ms. Jones? Discussion from board members?
If I may point something out, Mr.
Yes.
Gill. I do want members to know that there are deadlines for us submitting these reports that often fall outside the time frame of our own meetings. So not that it's a big deal, but if you look at the letter that I submitted with the reports, I noted to the legislature that we have yet to have a meeting where these reports would be submitted, and they were subject to further review and revision. So I didn't want any board member to think they didn't have an opportunity to give input, and if it was deemed necessary to make a modification, we've indicated to the legislature that we may in fact do so. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Thank you for the clarification. Discussion from board members? Ms. Berrios? Thank you. Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
On page page 162, item 4.3, consideration of LDE contracts and leases of $50,000 and over. The recommendation is to approve.
What about 4.2?
Is, That's my fault.
That's okay. 4.2?
Yes, 4.2, consideration of federal, state grants and allocations to LEAs, Type 2 charters, approved non-public schools, and community-based organizations. The recommendation is to approve.
Do we have a 146? Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Mr. Romer, a second?
Second.
Ms. Jones? Ms. Orange Jones? Any discussion on this item? This is on page 146. Okay, we have a one comment card from Ms. Berrios, item 4.2.
Lee Barrios, St. Tammany. I thought I was going to be slow in the uptake here, but I think everybody on the board must be asleep at this point. Anyway, I'm going to comment regarding if I'm on the correct agenda item, the item for the Justice Department, legal fees. I felt like I had to make a public comment on this for obvious reasons. $500,000.
I think that's actually another item.
Okay, is this 4.3?
No, this is 4.2.
4.2.
So I'm not quite as asleep.
Oh,
as
you're
you thought
on
I might have been.
4.2.
Yeah, this is 4.2.
Sorry. I'll be back.
So you had a comment for 4.2. You have one for 4.3 also.
I'm going to pass.
Okay.
I'll come back for 4.3. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay, Mr. Wayne, Billy Wayne. Representing the Urban Support Agency. Okay.
Chairman Gio, Superintendent White, esteemed Betsy members, Ms. Smith. My name is Billy Wayne, and I am the Executive Director of the Urban Support Agency, 9051 Mansfield Road, Suite E12, Shreveport, Louisiana. The agency truly appreciates the efforts given by the LDE in its improving and enhancing the lives of students throughout this state through 21st Century Program funding. I come this morning speaking on an issue as a result of referencing the Betsy Board minutes of June 19, 2013. When agencies and other providers applied for Cohort 8 21st Century funds, we were told that the funding procedure and the funding allocations were cut 20% after we received approval. In reviewing the Betsy minutes of June 19th, we discovered that not all providers who were granted funding received a cut. Some providers received their full allotted amount, while other providers did not. My particular agency had to cut 200 students because of the fact we received a 20% cut. The issue we have is centered around three things. And I'm sorry, you didn't tell me how much time I have. I don't want to go over.
5 minutes.
The issue that the agency has is centered around three things. First of all, we have requested from the LDE, Office 21st Century Programming, that we receive the funds due to us based upon the RFP formula and based upon the information we were given through the RFP and told by the department. We are requesting those funds be given to us because the rationale we have received thus far is that some of these programs had more attendance. Well, the problem with that is that no one told us that we could put additional numbers in our RFP. If that had been made known, Urban Support had better than 300 students that we could have added to the programming. Secondly, we have requested that these funds be allocated to us because we have been serving in excess of 150 students more given the cuts we were given and we have another 175 on the waiting list. So we are asking that our funding be equitable to those other excessive fund programs that were given in June. Secondly, we are asking, if funding is not available, that a reduction be given to all applicants and a redistribution of these excessive funds be given to all applicable programs as opposed to some. One of the things we had a problem with is that in the past, as recent as December 2012, some of these same programs that received excessive funding also received an extension of their funds through Cohort 7. Although we realize we are not questioning accountability, nor are we questioning rationale. We would like to know what the rationale is. So we are requesting that the funding that was given to some programs be given to all programs that meet the classifications and the requirements. The second thing we're requesting is that if the funding should not be made available, then a reduction be given to all programs as opposed to just some. And finally, we're requesting that no interruption of program services nor funding be incurred as this issue is revisited. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I'm going to ask the superintendent to respond.
I'm not familiar off the top of my head with the particulars of your case. I'm sure that our staff is, and I really appreciate you coming all the way from Shreveport to voice it. What I think would be helpful to me is if I could have just in writing the name of your organization and any specifics that you'd like to provide me so that I can...
sent an email out to you on yesterday, and a certified letter is forthcoming.
Okay. And I will just, my email address is john.white@la.gov. If you could just make sure that whatever email that was gets to that address, we'll certainly review it.
Thank you, sir. I
Thank you.
definitely would do that. I sent an email and CC'd all board members on yesterday. You didn't receive it?
I'm sure some did, but
Okay.
if you could just get it to me, it's
I
my...
will, sir.
yes.
I will, definitely.
Thank you so much. I
Thank
appreciate
you so
it.
much, sir.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you. God bless.
I have a question.
Ms. Hill?
In regards to the 21st Century Grant, maybe I don't know if staff here is able to answer some concerns that I may have, because I have questioned the same thing in regards to the 21st Century Grant when the funding is allocated, how it's allocated, and things of that nature, because I'll see various groups receive more funding than others, and some of the groups that really need the funding receive the least amount versus the groups that really may not need it because of the population of students that they're serving. So I guess my question, Superintendent White, would be, what are the procedures or the protocol in regards to how we allocate the funding for the 21st Century Grant?
There is a competitive process that, as of 3 years ago, takes into account student learning that's been achieved by each of the providers. Using that formula, the dollars are rewarded. It's also important to note that this is a federal program. There are thus federal regulations attached to the program, and that if providers are outside the bounds of those, then they no longer are able to participate, or their levels of participation can be reduced. I'd be happy to provide the board with an update as to who receives these funds and such later as well.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Any other comments from Ms. Smith?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I did have an opportunity to meet with Mr. Wayne over the holidays, and I think, and I know that there were students actually that were cut from the program in the Blanchard area. So I think mainly what we need to find out for him is if there's something that some requirement that he's not meeting with his organization, then that's what he needs to know. And so that's what I think we're looking for, is what does he need to be able to be eligible for those funds. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Any objection to the motion? Motion.
I made the second, I think. I don't know. I can't remember. I think Ms. Orange Jones made the...
I made the motion.
Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
On page 162, item 4.3, consideration of LDE contracts and leases of $50,000 and over. The recommendation is to approve.
Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Mr. Romer, second. Mr. Garvey? Any discussion on this item from board members?
Members, The contracts in front of you really fall out into two categories, and I want to just describe both of them for you. Number one, the state has continuing obligations as a defendant in a number of lawsuits. In the instances in which those lawsuits are education related, we oftentimes as either the board or just as the state, as a department, are the ones providing the defense. You see 3 contracts in front of you for attorneys in the area of special education, in the area of desegregation and civil rights issues, and in the issue of the MFP. We have a legal team of just several lawyers who are full-time staff, as common practice across many government agencies. We staff outside expert attorneys, and you'll have those contracts in front of you. I will tell you about this. While it sounds from some of the comments that we're going to have some discussion about this issue, I'm the first to say that I regret that there is this litigation. However, given our positions, we have to defend ourselves in court, have to defend our interpretation of the law in court, and given the volume and some of the areas of expertise, legal counsel is required outside the agency. The other contract in front of you regards data certification. This is a process that the agency has ongoing. It's just a process essentially for validating that student by student, and then when you aggregate the data into subgroups, that those data are clean, so that when these the letter grades are issued, for example, school performance score, all of those data have been validated and are accurate. We have, for years, had a data validation certification service, and we recently, through a competitive bid process, put this contract up for bid. You're now having the contract in front of you for approval. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your input, Superintendent. Any further board discussion? Ms. Berrios?
Lee Berrios, St. Tammany. I just feel like I have to speak for the taxpayers on both the Justice Department suit and the defense against the special ed, discrimination of special ed students in the charter schools. I think the Justice Department case has been misrepresented to the public in that really it, and you can correct me and speak to this, Mr. White, please, if you have a different viewpoint, but it's about getting the information that the Justice Department needs in order to ascertain if deseg orders have been, if there's a problem with those, not that they're trying to stop our voucher program. And so dumping this money into this deep, dark hole just seems like a waste of taxpayer money. And then the idea of spending another $125,000 to defend the practice of discriminating against special ed students in the RSD schools also is quite objectionable. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
I just want to say that I was not in support of the policies, and therefore when it comes time to vote, I'll vote accordingly.
I'm sorry, clarify that one more time.
I was not in support of the policies, and therefore when we take our vote, I will vote accordingly.
Okay. Any other comments from the board? Any objection to the motion?
I object.
Ms. Hill and Dr. Beebe objects to the motion. Next item.
On page 168, item 4.4, consideration of a report from Education Finance staff concerning Type 2 charter school budgets and expenditure reports, including irregularities or concerns. The recommendation is to receive.
Do I have a motion to receive?
So move.
Ms. Bofia, second. Ms. Jones?
Second.
Any discussion from board members?
Mr. Guillaume, I don't know if the first one would have been the more appropriate item, but because I was not yet awake, obviously, I would want to say at this point in time that we've heard a lot about irregularities and concerns within charter entities, traditional public systems. Just recently, I think last week, there was a report and concerning a whistleblower and accountability and so forth. So I think it's important for this board, when these things happen, that we receive communication from Superintendent White regarding allegations. And so I'm prepared to listen to the presentation, but would like to offer a motion to that effect, that we receive, that BESE be notified immediately of any allegations, and so that we will be cognizant of those concerns, particularly if it's publicized via various media sources. We would be able to respond accordingly. So,
Now, Dr. Beebe, we're on a charter school item here.
no, I realize, I prefaced my comments by saying I may be out of order.
Right.
It was possibly the audit report, that the first item, but I wanted to make a motion to the effect that BESE would be notified of any irregularities, whether it's a charter school, traditional public school, et cetera.
Well, let's, Ms. Rum, I was going to say, could we take that up at the very end of the?
We can, but I have a comment.
Yeah, sure.
That may help. There have been a few different reports regarding different schools in the last month that you've been aware of in the press. I did forward that information to board members, except in the last instance, it's Mr. White, Superintendent White did in fact inform me and did copy me on a letter regarding one of those, and if I didn't forward it to the rest of the board members, that's my fault, so I will certainly make sure, but I want to make sure everybody understands that Superintendent White did inform me of what was happening and told me what step he was going to take, and he copied me that in a letter. So I will certainly, I've tried to forward that information when as much as I can, and if I fail to in this particular instance, I apologize, and we'll certainly make sure I get that to you.
Okay.
I would just add that while I certainly appreciate what you said, Mr. Romer, my protocol has been to, where there is a statewide issue, such as with the Type 2 charter school that came under investigation, I inform the entire board. Where there is simply a local issue covering a specific parish, as happened this week in East Baton Rouge Parish, I informed Ms. Hill and Mr. Romer, as they are the elected members in that particular parish. If there's a matter that you believe would merit greater notification to the rest of the board, I'm certainly happy to take that specific instance up, and I'll change my practice as well. And if you want to put a motion to that, you're more than welcome to, but I'm happy just to engage you in a dialogue, Dr. Beebe, as to how I can best serve you.
I appreciate that, Superintendent White, but and I understand that it involved a school in Ms. Hill's district, but news circulates, and so therefore there were discussions, and I really couldn't respond. But of course, I understand these were allegations. But when my motion is in order, Mr. Gio, I will offer the motion.
As the chair, I'll go ahead and take it now, so we can handle it.
So I move that BESE direct the superintendent and staff of LDOE to notify BESE formally whenever they become aware that any school under the jurisdiction of BESE, including traditional public schools, charter schools, or RSD schools, and scholarship schools, are under investigation by any agency of the state or federal government. Such report should be sent to each BESE member. So that's my motion.
And I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion by Dr. Beebe and a second by Ms. Hill. Any discussion from other
I
board
have a
members?
question. Superintendent, if you could take a guess at how many times would you have to notify us throughout the year if this were to pass? Would this be a tremendous new set of notifications, or just a couple here and there?
I think it probably would be in the hundreds. It really depends how you legally define the term investigation. But if you take it to be any time there's an inquiry about whether or not someone has broken a rule, which that's what I would call it, it probably would be in the hundreds.
Ms. Hill?
Yes, I'd just like to make a statement in regards to board members being informed, and I would just like to disagree with Superintendent White in regards to him notifying me about the allegations within my district. How I found out in regards to the allegation was through media source. I reached out to him. He didn't reach out to me. So I think the motion at hand that Ms. Beebe have put forth, and me second the motion, is to inform, because as a constituent that represent majority of a district, if I'm not aware and allegations are being put forth and my constituent base are coming to me and I'm not aware of anything, I can't articulate to them what's going on. And then I have to reach out to the superintendent, and I understand he had to reach out to Mr. Romer because he's the board president, but as a respect, or maybe just as a courtesy, just to reach out to a board member, if it's in their district, to let them know what has transpired, so we can know how to articulate to the community and to the media from a board perspective. And I think that would be more fair.
That seems like a fair request. You were copied on the letter that I sent to Mr. Taylor, Dr. Taylor, which is the first formal communication that we had on this. You were right there on the letter. What I would suggest, members, is my view is that probably it's going to be very hard to craft a policy that appropriately captures every time you would want to know something about your district. I understand what Dr. Beebe is saying. I think she's identifying a very fair problem, which is you don't want to read about serious allegations in the news. However, for example, there was a school board member arrested in a district recently, and that's an issue that if I were a local board member, I'd want to know. I'm not sure that that's entirely important to every single person on this board. We have nearly 70 school systems around the state and 150 LEAs. Perhaps in lieu, Ms. Beebe, Dr. Beebe, of your motion, I might recommend to the board that I will heighten my awareness of the sensitivity of the kinds of issues that you describe, and if you don't see an appropriate level of coordination, then of course I'd be open to rulemaking. But I might suggest for now that the best thing is just for us to be aware of the issue, try to do our best. I don't want to overload you with information, and at the same time as I want to be responsive to concerns. That would be my urging.
Dr. Beebe, would that be acceptable to you?
Well, Superintendent White, I can appreciate, the concern for the notification to all board members. But once again, we do have our individual districts, but at the same time, I view my role as a representative for the entire state. And if it's newsworthy, I think that we should be informed, just out of common courtesy, if we are approached. In fact, sometimes I receive phone calls from reporters, and it's not dealing specifically with my district. It might be, in some of your districts, and I generally say, well, and I had this happen, and I often say, my response is, I would prefer that you contact the board member from that district first, and then if you don't get a response, I'll be more than happy to respond. So I just think this is a common courtesy. With technology, emails, it's just a click of a button. I mean, I'm not saying that you have to put everything, but news alert, this is happening, and I just want you to be aware of it. If you have a need for further if you have further questions, then feel free to contact someone at my office. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's going to be a tremendous responsibility for you, Mr. White.
Ms. Bophy.
Well, so this is the thing. I appreciate the level of communication that I have with the superintendent. And while I do understand Ms. Beebe's concern for our responsibility for the whole state, I also, as an individual board member, have to figure out how to balance the issues that I need to pay attention to against the ones that don't necessarily need my attention. So there's a number of issues related to schools that I'm able to read about in the paper, and so far I haven't had a situation where I wasn't informed about something in a timely manner. I'm going to have to vote against this. I would appreciate it if the two of you could get to a point to where you would you're comfortable with the level of communication, but I don't think a policy to where everything that we're going to read about in the paper is going to end up in our inbox is necessary.
And if I may respond, Mr. Gill, and look, it's a new year. I offered a resolution. I want to make every effort to work collaboratively and professionally. My motion is to direct BESE, the superintendent rather, and the staff of those schools that are under our jurisdictions that would be investigated. They would be deemed under an investigation by any agency of the state and federal government. Now, if someone is arrested for DUI or whatever, I'm not saying this, but I'm saying, those that are under state and federal investigation, that's what's in the motion, but as I pointed out earlier, I would appreciate more communication from Mr. White. Now, that's not to negate that he doesn't communicate with you, Ms. Bophy, but I seldom have conversations with Superintendent White. That's not to say the majority of you are not informed, but I would like to be informed. That is my motion. I'm not withdrawing it. We'll take the vote.
Ms. Jones?
I do have a follow-up question. Dr. Beebe, is your motion, I can't remember can you read the phrasing again? I just want to hear it again.
It's lengthy. Okay, I move that BESE direct the superintendent and the staff of LDOE to notify BESE formally when they become aware that any school under the jurisdiction of BESE, including traditional public schools, charter schools, RSD schools, and scholarship schools, are under investigation by any agency of the state or federal government, such report should be sent to each BESE member.
And just for clarification, what is your definition of formal? Formal notification.
Formal would be, I mean, I know that email is not necessarily formal, but it could be, if it's on stationery or what have you, it would be perceived as such, a notification.
Okay, any further?
I don't understand. I'm not certain how you define investigation, and that's where I get, because there's allegations daily from a variety of sources, a variety of people, and if we take every allegation, therefore prompting an investigation, then all of a sudden every allegation is newsworthy at that point. I get worried. There does need to be some caution about every phone call that's received that makes an allegation, and we verify, we try to follow up. Is that an official investigation, or is that just a follow-up? I'm just trying to make sure if we're going to pass something that we can fit within a framework that's practical. I will say specifically in the instances that have happened recently, those happened immediately. I mean, they were newsworthy at the exact same time that we're being told about them. So, it wasn't like this was 6 months of an investigation and then at the last second before it became a news item, we were informed. These things happened simultaneously with the communication. So there was like no delay between the flow of information. I mean, it was done as quickly as was practical, I would think. So I'm not trying to say I don't agree with your sentiment. I agree with your sentiment that serious instances in each of our districts you should know about. How do you define that? I mean, how many emails do you get a day about an allegation going on at a particular school? I get a lot. Now, curious as I'm just trying to figure out how to manage that process. I don't see defining these words become have a very practical impact on the flow of information, and a very practical impact on what becomes an anonymous phone call becomes an official investigation. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. I don't have.
Perhaps if law enforcement is involved, that would be something to consider. Of that caliber, if you will. But I think we need improved communications on this board. Case in point, and I hate to go back to the past, but I sat here by a board member, and 2 board members tendered their resignation about a year or so ago, and I read about it in the paper rather than getting a phone call from the department. So I just feel that we need to improve communications, particularly when it involves our schools and there is law enforcement involved. That is the intent.
May I make a recommendation? I would say, and I think that's a very valid point, that instance in which you just raised, for example, wouldn't be covered by your motion. Maybe I can make a recommendation. It does strike me that we don't have a protocol written down. Why don't my staff work with Ms. Cope and bring you a recommended protocol as a board for just a set of guidelines that we can use and hopefully agree on. We can bring that at the next meeting for when it is that we send whole group emails, when it is that we notify you as an individual. And if you take issue with what we've brought back, then we can have that discussion then. Would that work?
That would work.
Then we agree to do that, Bridget. Let's make sure that we do that, and we'll work, Heather, with you as well on that.
Well, and I want to say I appreciate that, and I appreciate Ms. Beebe agreeing to let's see if we can come up with a protocol, because I think your point's valid and important, and I think we ought to make sure we get it right. I will take some blame myself on the one particular instance with EBR. I don't know that it did happen all on the same day, and I did not distribute the letter that I received from Mr. White to everyone, and so I certainly apologize for that, because I certainly, in those types of communication, try to get it out to all the board as quickly as I can as well. So your point's well made, and I appreciate it.
So, Dr. Beebe, you're withdrawing your motion? Okay. Thank you for the comments and the input. Let's go back to item 4.4. Do we have a motion and a second on that item? Yes. Okay. Is there further discussion from the board on item 4.4? Ms. Berrios? I caught you off guard, didn't I? Thank you. Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
On page 171, item 5.1, consideration of a report from education finance staff concerning Type 5 charter school budgets and expenditure reports, including irregularities or concerns. The recommendation is to receive.
So move.
Ms. Bofia, do I have a second?
Second.
Ms. Jones? Discussion on this item. Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
On page 178, item 5.2, consideration of RSD contracts and leases of $50,000 and over. The recommendation is to approve.
Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Mr. Romer, second. Mr. Garvey? Any board discussion on this item?
I would clarify, members, that these are exclusively contracts associated with the FEMA-funded rebuilding of schools in Orleans Parish. They are predominantly architecture, design, and construction contracts.
Ms. Berrios?
Lee Berrios, St. Tammany. The majority of the public isn't aware of what goes on and some of the agenda items and the details that are provided online. So I just wanted to point out something that in itself makes a statement. In your contract with Gordon, Arata, McCollum, Duplantis, and Egan, again, for legal fees, you had an original contract with them for almost $2.5 million, and this is covering for litigation concerning the RSD, the building of schools. This one would increase it by almost $1 million. And for my statement, I'd like to just read the justification that the Department of Ed itself wrote. It said this: the Recovery School District has embarked upon a massive capital program as part of its master plan to rebuild the Orleans Parish public school system. The construction projects which arise out of this capital rebuilding program are large and complex and give rise to many legal issues. The construction industry is litigious, and threatened and actual litigation has already manifested itself. The number of lawsuits filed against the RSD over these construction projects is on the rise. Additionally, the bid and review process and the preparation and revision of construction contract documents, architect contract documents, and related agreements are complicated and demanding, requiring the expenditure of a large number of attorney hours. Due to the litigious nature of the construction industry, the amount of money involved in the award of these construction contracts and the scope of the rebuilding program, the amount of required legal work is increasing. I find it really makes a statement about, first of all, the competency of the RSD's ability to manage this huge project, and also I find it interesting to make such an allegation about the construction industry when it seems to be one of the department's agenda's biggest supporters. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Yeah, Mr. Romer.
I mean, I certainly wish there were no legal fees. I think everybody would wish that. I would actually state that I think the RSD management of this project has been done very well so far. If you look at the percentage of contract changes, it's been below the industry standard. It is a very complicated process. It is a massive project. I don't find it unusual for there to be litigation. Perhaps this characterization is too broad here, but I don't find it out of the ordinary. So, I agree with you that this language seems probably could be written more accurately, but I just didn't want to dismiss the comment that this is a commentary on the competency of the management of the program. So I want to commend the management on the program. Again, I hope we can avoid litigation when possible, but the reports on the capital project are very thorough, and I appreciate their work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that, and I will pass that to Mr. Bordelon, Ms. Hankins, and others. I do also want to reflect that I believe the language should be tightened up, as I don't think it's meant as an indictment of construction managers. It is meant as a comment on the business of construction work being, by its nature, procurement heavy and thus litigation heavy. It is certainly not meant as a criticism of contractors. So my apologies for the lack of clarity, and we will, in our next iteration of this kind of language, tighten that up.
Any further discussion from the board on 5.2? Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
On page 238, item 6.1, consideration of HG funding cycle activities, building the budget for FY 2014-2015. The recommendation is to approve.
Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Ms. Bophy, second.
I'll second.
Mr. Garvey. Ms. Bophy, would you like to speak to this?
Yes, I would like to say that while I know not all of the concerns of board members are going to be addressed, I do think that that the proposal in front of you addresses some of the concerns that were raised at the last meeting, and those of you who have who've had concerns and that we've talked about it, I think that we're in a good place. I feel as though this is an opportunity for us to think about, or for us to begin to introduce competitive grants back in, while at the same time respecting the work that our districts have been doing with using HG dollars to fund pre-K in the past. This is something that I worked on with Ms. Bradford for a number of months. We had a more robust committee, but our board changes over time, and so Ms. Hill and I were able to discuss this, and I think that her questions were answered in that process, and I'm happy to answer any other questions any of you have relative to this item.
Dr. Beebe?
What is the status of those districts participating in the competitive grant? When is the deadline? Wasn't it
I'm going to
February?
call on staff to come up and help us with that, because they are going to manage that process for us.
Okay, Kim Trippo, AG Director. We do not have any applications that have come in or proposals that have come in thus far. The deadline is February the 3rd.
February 3rd?
Yes.
And I think, I have a concern there, and I think that that could have been the lack of participation, if you will, may be attributed to our discussion. If you recall, I think in December, Superintendent White alluded to the concern if we put it in, if we allocated the competitive grant funding, that it might reduce staff, employees, and so forth. And I think the word trickled out, the message got out to our districts, which might have discouraged some from applying, because these proposals are somewhat time-consuming if you write them effectively. So that might have discouraged some from participating. And
and if I may, we've had, several people have inquired, several districts and agencies have inquired, and I'm confident that we'll get several probably a multitude of proposals to come through.
What would be disadvantages of pushing the deadline date back some to give districts more time to work on their applications? I mean, I know I've been through these conversations with you, but let's talk through relative to the context of what we're working in right now and see if there might be a little more time that we could give districts. What would be the consequences of doing it?
Heather's coming up, so I guess she has.
There's my consequence person.
The consequence person is here.
Heather Cope, Executive Director of BESE. I think the main consequences if we were to push back the competitive deadline would just be when anyone who is awarded a grant can expect to have that information and start really planning for implementation. We had set the April meeting as the desired meeting to have the board approve any of the competitive grants, so that way anyone who's receiving a grant would have about 2.5 months before the fiscal year began to really know that they would be implementing this project and have time to plan. If anyone's received a grant before, once you get it, it's actually a lot of work to get ready to do the work. So we want to give grantees a lot of time to do that, and we as staff need time to go through all the applications, have our third-party reviewers look at them, and then talk to the work group and be able to come back to the board in April with recommendations for your consideration. So that just takes some time. We're certainly open to trying to flex that. Some of it just depends too on how many applications we get.
Right.
If we get 50, that takes a lot more time. If we get 10,
how much time could we compress the staff's amount of time? I know this was built on the ideal, right? It was built on the ideal that it would pass in the fall and the districts would have knowledge. So how much time could we compress? Because I understand what you're trying to do by getting the answers back to districts, and I don't want to mess that up, but I think any time that we could give. The other question I think the board needs to help me think through is would there be any consequences to changing the date? Like, is that unfair to any applicants? But I guess none of the applicants have come in yet, so that would be fine. Okay.
I think if the board work group would be willing to commit to looking at the recommendations of the reviewers on an expedited timeline, we could probably push back the deadline. But it really depends on if you all can make yourselves available. We wanted to leave a lot of time for that, so that way we wouldn't be.
How much time do we have right now?
With the reviewers, we set aside some generous time. If we can condense your window down to 2 weeks, we could probably push back the deadline 2 weeks.
Giving me more than 2 weeks to do anything is probably too much time anyway, Ms. Cope. But good, yeah. Ms. Beebe, do you think 2 weeks would be meaningful to districts if we were to pass this policy and they had 2 more weeks to work on applications relative to the concerns you brought up? Is 2 more weeks something that would be helpful?
I think where there's a will, there's a way. If they're really motivated to get the job done, they could. I mean, the concern is, as I communicated, that some heard the message loud and clear and really felt that, the thought was, well, why should I go through this work and we're not even going to be considered? So I'm just bringing that forward.
I appreciate that concern, and I appreciate the staff for thinking about how we may deal with that concern appropriately. Thank you. So I would, do we have to do anything formally to change that process, or could you notify people in the ways you've done already? Okay. So what is the date right now for the
3rd of February.
Okay. And so you'll come up with a new date and get that out to people as soon as this board makes a decision about whether or not it's going to support competitive grants?
Thank you, Ms. Bofian, for your hard work, you and Ms. Bradford and Ms. Hill on this item. We have one public comment from Michael Masterson with Ben Franklin High School.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Ben Franklin High School is working on a competitive grant under this program. Thank you. Ben Franklin High School is working on a grant under this competitive program, and we are finding that more time would be extremely helpful. It's a program where we're discussing cooperation with other schools, and a couple more weeks would actually improve the quality of our application and the resulting program.
Thank you for your input.
I just want to pause for a second, and I want to congratulate and thank Ben Franklin High School. As you know, it's one of the top-rated high schools in the country, and I think there are a lot of schools that, if they have that ranking, kind of rest on their laurels and accept things, but when it comes to advanced placement, when it comes to college dual enrollment, when it comes to course choice, and you'll see later today we'll discuss, Ben Franklin has been willing both in person and online to make its content and experiences available to kids around the state. This is a school that, under Tim Rusnak's leadership, really does not stop innovating. And I really want to thank you for being not just at the top, but continuing to pull us ahead. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Mr. White, very much. I'll transmit that to Dr. Rusnak when I see him.
If you would. Thank you.
Appreciate you being here. Any further discussion on this item? Any objection to the motion?
I just want to recuse myself, please.
Okay,
Have that
yeah.
on the record.
If you note, Ms. Orange-Jones recused herself. Any objection? Motion carries. Next item. Congratulations, Ms. Bofi. I know that's been a lot of work, and I think that's moving in the right direction.
On page 240, item 6.2, consideration of an executive session relative to the Victor S. Hodgkins et al. Versus Louisiana State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education et al. Consent judgment.
Okay, I need a motion to go into executive session to discuss the Victor Hodgkins and others versus the Louisiana State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education consent judgment. Ms. Smith, do I have a second?
Second.
Dr. Beebe, I ask for a roll call vote to go into executive session, please.
Dr. Beebe?
Yes.
Dr. Beebe voted yes. Ms. Bofi?
Yes.
Ms. Bofi, yes. Ms. Bradford? Ms. Bradford is absent. Mr. Garvey?
Yes.
Mr. Garvey voted yes. Ms. Hill?
Yes.
Ms. Hill voted yes. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee is absent. Dr. Moranti?
Yes.
Dr. Moranti voted yes. Ms. Orange-Jones?
Yes.
Ms. Orange-Jones voted yes. Mr. Romer?
Yes.
Mr. Romer voted yes. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith voted yes. Mr. Gill, you would
Yes.
vote.
Okay, yeah.
Motion passed.
I would remind the public that there'll be no votes in executive session, and any votes that we decide to cast would be in the public. So we'll reconvene after executive session.
I know it's
We're going to go ahead and reconvene the Admin and Finance Committee meeting. Do I have a motion to reconvene?
Second.
Ms. Smith and Ms. Bophy. Any objection to reconvening? Okay, motion carries. I'm going to ask for a motion concerning the matter that we've just discussed in executive session. Dr. Moranti?
I would like to move that BESE request legal counsel to take necessary action to seek clarification regarding the consent judgment in Hodgkins et al. Versus the Louisiana Board of Elementary and Secondary Education in light of subsequent Supreme Court jurisprudence.
Do I have a second to that motion? Mr. Garvey? Any discussion? Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
Page 241, item 7.1, consideration of a report in response to legislation from the 2013 legislative session. The recommendation is to receive.
Do I have a motion to receive?
So moved.
Ms. Bophy, a second. Mr. Garvey? Any discussion on this item from the board? Ms. Berrios?
Barrios, St. Tammany. I want to make sure I'm on the right agenda item. This also concerns the evaluation of the superintendent. That's part of it? Okay, wrong
I
item.
don't
Glad
think so.
asked.
I think that's...
Okay, I'll pass then until we get to that part. Thank
Okay, yeah. Okay, item 7.1, we have a motion and a second on the report. Okay, Ms. Ray, sorry about that.
Hi, I'm Mary Patricia Ray with the Louisiana Federation of Teachers. I had the good fortune of serving as a proxy for our president, Steve Monahan, at the final meeting of the textbook task force, at which we looked over the draft of this report. And there were many recommendations that were a consensus of the task force with regard to amendments or some changes that we thought should be made to better reflect what the task force had discovered during its several meetings. And one of those things that that there was consensus on was that while many of the recommendations in the report would come with a perceived savings or a perceived cost to local school districts, that as we recommended these things to you, that we would also recommend that BESE continue to seek full adequate funding for all of the measures, whether they were cost neutral or not, that if they did come with a cost, that y'all would continue to advocate for full funding. And it appears that the language that actually is in the recommendation and the conclusion talks about seeking flexibility of current or future funding. It's on that last page. And it's just, and I speak only for our group and the folks that were on the task force that did have consensus on this, that that's not exactly what we intended to appear in the recommendations. And I did submit a card that was for information only, not to oppose or support the recommendations, but just to give that point of information that I don't think that, actually I know that that does not fully encompass what the task force recommended. That said, I do want to thank all the staff that worked really hard on this task force and some of the other ones that we've had over the past several months, many meetings for, including Mr. Bradford, who headed this one up. We really appreciate everything that DOE staff, BESE staff has done to make sure that these task force are productive and that we get some good recommendations out of them. So thank you.
Thank you for your input, Ms. Ray. Any further discussion on this item? Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
On page 248, item 7.2, consideration of revisions to the framework for the annual evaluation of State Superintendent of Education. the recommendations are to approve the revisions and defer the evaluation.
Do I have a motion to that effect?
I'll make a motion.
Mr.
And I'll
Romer?
second it.
Ms. Bofi?
And I'll give, if I may, just a quick comment.
Okay.
We've obviously we give an annual review of the superintendent, and we've every year there's been some improvement in the process, and based on our own set of objectives and goals, sometimes the metrics change, and so some of that is reflected within this, and Ms. Cope can clarify or answer questions to that. I would say the biggest change that we're really seeking to make is to actually move the evaluation till April. Last year, if you remember, we did the evaluation in January, but there was a piece of data that was not available until April. So we kind of did an evaluation, but it had to sit on the shelf until we got the information in April. What we're suggesting now is that we move all of the evaluation to April to do it all at one time. That would also give members additional chance to look at this rubric, and if in fact they see a way to improve it, that's still possible. We've worked with the superintendent's office and with Ms. Cope at looking at the rubric. It has been improved, in my opinion. The main change is the time change, just moving it to April so that we have all the information. But if you have further questions or comment, certainly.
Dr. Beebe?
Mr. Romer, the ratings, did those change? Because
No, are you talking about the...
ineffective, the
May
range?
May I answer?
Sure.
So you're talking about the different, like, ineffective, effective,
Yes, the
proficient?
ratings.
No, those didn't change. Those ranges didn't change.
So what within here, because it says that there were changes other than, and we
Right.
also know that the time frame is of concern.
So
what other change?
Okay, so another change is that the goals that we had last year were built around multi-year goals instead of annual goals, and so it wasn't very difficult for us to extrapolate from that to come up with targets based on those one-year goals. But once you start looking at these multi-year goals, it does complicate the process. So that was one of the changes. Another change is, if you'll remember from last year, we had a focus on students arriving to 4th grade on time and on level, students arriving to 9th grade on time and on level. And so that's changed to match what our expectations are for our schools and our educators. And you'll see the second item here in the packet that you're looking at is students achieve at rigorous levels on assessments in 3rd through 8th grade. And so you have that to match all of the changes that we've made with our districts. The superintendent's evaluation will reflect that those same aspirations.
Mr. Romer?
If I may add, we also hope to get this instrument in a shape that we're not having to make an adjustment again next year. I don't know that we'll achieve that, but we're trying to look at what's relevant for this past year and the current year that we're in, and what would it still be relevant for next year, so that this process next year is just, it'll come back to us in April with the metric already established, and we'll be not making additional modifications.
That and just like we do with our educators, that we can establish goals ahead of time. And so those are, we want a process in place to where our instrument is a good foundation. And as you remember from last year, we had to start fresh with the instrument basically. And so that is the hope. I do think, just like we have transition policies with our districts and our schools and districts and our educators, that we'll also have to keep those transition issues in mind with the superintendent, especially along the availability of data because there's some data that you need a baseline for and able to establish what the potential targets are.
May I ask a question of staff real quick?
Sure.
For the point of clarity, because if we were to do what's suggested here today, you would still have the opportunity to, when do we meet again, in February? We have March? If it would help your own thinking, we ought to, and I should have included it here, it didn't dawn on me, highlight the differences. So we can distribute to you where the change is, and you can more clearly see where there's been a change. I think that'll help you ultimately make a decision. But even if we were to move this forward today, you would still have one more opportunity in March for clarity or to make a modification. So,
Okay.
Any further discussion from the board? Ms.
I
Bowker?
just want to reiterate the possibility of moving it forward. Last year when we did the evaluation but couldn't finalize it because we were missing that piece of information, I believe it's student cohort graduation rate. And so I don't think it's a very good protocol for us to have an evaluation of the superintendent, but then know that we're going to have to delay it, know that we're not going to be able to make that evaluation final for a couple of months. And so that's the thinking behind extending it to April. I don't know if that was a question of yours, but I do want the board members to realize, I just don't think it's very good practice for us to do all this work, but it's not final until we get this last piece of information.
We do have one comment card, Ms. Berrios.
Lee Berrios, retired teacher, St. Tammany. This policymaking body continues to support basing a qualitative evaluation primarily on quantitative measures, whether it's student learning, teacher effectiveness, school performance. I really wish Mr. White hadn't left, but he needs to hear this. Or now the superintendent's evaluation. Specifically, I'm speaking of the results of a single high-stakes standardized test. All reputable research, including that accepted by the U.S. Ed Department and published on their website, warns against the use of high-stakes standardized tests as a primary measure of accountability when it carries the kinds of consequences we use here in Louisiana, high stakes. That being said, it's particularly inappropriate for the use of school performance scores to be used to evaluate the effectiveness of the person who has sole control over its formula and the results. We saw that this year, most particularly when Superintendent White changed the school performance score 2 or 3 times during the year to achieve the results he wanted, which produced an increase in many lower performing schools' performance score and a lowering of SPS for some higher performing. If this evaluation was designed to give the impression that our state superintendent has placed himself in an equitable position with educators in this state, it is obviously missing one important element, and that is the total lack of control of teachers, students, and schools that they have, and the total control that the superintendent has. I ask you not to pass this evaluation process.
Ms. Berrios, just as a clarification, this instrument was created by BESE. It was not created by the superintendent, and this is a BESE-led quantitative and qualitative evaluation.
I realize that.
Thank
It's
you.
still wrong.
Any further discussion?
And I just want to make sure that we do give to all board members a comparison so they can easily see what changes have been
Sure.
made.
Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. Next item.
On page 254, item 7.3, consideration of position statements for the 2014 legislative session. The recommendation is to approve.
Do I have a motion to approve?
So move.
Ms. Bofi, second.
I'll second.
Dr. Moranti. Discussion.
Board members, I'll just, if I may, Mr. Gill.
Yes, Mr. Roman.
These are generally the same statements we entered last legislative session with. They're reflective of policy positions that we've taken in the past. During the session, it becomes a bit difficult to manage the process when bills are constantly changing, so this is meant to give guidance to DOE and the superintendent as to what our general wishes are as legislation works its way through the process. So it's very similar to what we did last year, and I would ask for your support.
Any further discussion from the board? We have 2 public comments. Mr. Garrett, Dan Garrett. Louisiana School Board Association.
Mr. Chairman, members, I'm wearing my other hat today, representing the Louisiana School Board Association. It's going to seem a bit out of order because it references the MFP task force, but I think it is important, especially since you're establishing your legislative framework for the coming session. I think it would be appropriate to add an item that you would support any amendments to existing statutory law that are necessary to carry out any of the provisions of the MFP that come from the MFP task force. It may seem like a little thing, but it would be important that we make sure that the MFP task force recommendations, if approved, and if there is a need to amend some statutory law, and I've looked at some of them, and I think that there are some minor amendments that need to take place to make things work, that the board support the making of those amendments so that you don't have a conflict between the statutory law and the MFP.
Thank you for your comments. Ms. Berrios? Thank you. Any further discussion from the board? Any objection to the motion?
I object.
Dr. Beebe and Ms. Hill object. Motion carries. Next item.
On page 257, item 8.1, consideration of an update report and recommendations of the Minimum Foundation Program Task Force. The recommendation is to receive and approve.
Just for clarification, we also have a report. We had two reports before we have a motion. Since the task force just met last week, the time to get those minutes out, you now have them before you today. And then the House Resolution 148 report back to the legislature came yesterday afternoon, and you have a copy of it. As clarification from staff, do we need separate motions, one to approve the task force recommendations and one to submit or approve and submit the report? That's correct? Okay, so we'll take these as two separate items.
I move approval of the item 1, I suppose. Is that what I need to do?
Yes. Approval of the task force recommendations. That's correct. Do I have a second?
I second.
Ms. Bophy. The motion by Mr. Romer, second by Mr. Bophy. I'll make a few comments. As you heard from the testimony earlier, what you have before you today was passed overwhelmingly by the task force. There are some objections within, some of the members of the task force, but overall it was a 20-member task force. I would reiterate that the conversation was very constructive. It was informative, and I think was a very healthy conversation and debate. And it wasn't, I would say, the expectation over 4 or 5 months. We weren't quite sure what we were to come back with, but as the chair, I couldn't be more pleased with the level of that we got to in the final recommendations that are being passed in 4 or 5 intense months of reviewing the information. If we approve these today as a board, and you've heard some of this testimony earlier, the next step is to really work out the mechanics. And that's where the rubber meets the road. And you'll notice in the actual minute or the actual recommendations that were passed, overall these are frameworks and concepts, but there is a lot of meat and a lot of detail that have to go to the point that it is a resolution. I want to personally thank the members of the task force, all the stakeholders that were there, and the department and Superintendent White, especially for his work and his guidance in very short notice in producing a lot of information for the task force to consider. But Mr. Romer?
If I may, I want to thank Mr. Gio for his job. We agreed that he would chair the task force. I want to thank the members of the task force. I thought we had you did an excellent job, Mr. Gio, and the members of the task force did an excellent job contributing and having a good discussion. I don't want to pretend that the ongoing discussion is finished. It's not, but certainly in a relatively short period of time to come up with some meaningful modifications and framework and general consensus. You should be commended for your effort, and I appreciate the work and time you put in, Jay, and to the members of the task force.
Any further discussion on this item?
Yes, sir, Mr.
Dr. Beebe?
Well, in fact, Mr. Gee, I want to echo the sentiment communicated this morning. Obviously, I did not have the opportunity to attend the MFP meetings, task force meetings, but there has been a resounding applause for your leadership in that area. And I also have heard the comments offered by various representatives, and this is certainly a decision I don't take lightly, but and then I know the comments made that, you know, we need to consider teacher salaries or providing money for our educators. And I will say, and I've said it often, it's not always about the money. Of course, any money given is appreciated. I think, well, in fact, I can personally attest to a study I conducted, and I think our teachers are more concerned with having the resources available to them to do the job. And of course, another factor that surfaced was shared and supportive leadership. So I think resources, having the availability of funds. Now, I know we've had discussions about course choice and career and college and career opportunities, and I support opportunities for children. And I would but I also have to speak to Superintendent White. You know, when we look at these reform initiatives, I think there would be more buy-in if they were truly vetted, and I think we always rush without getting adequate stakeholder input. And then I see that, you know, with the ruling on course choice, when we say that we're going to give districts money, but in my opinion, we're circumventing law, if you will. But with all of that said, I know our districts are hurting out there, and we haven't had the 2.75% increase for some time, 5 years exactly. And I just think that, like I said, my decision is based on what I view to be in the best interest of children, while I support the concerns of those who spoke on behalf of special education and certainly early childhood education. I support all of those endeavors, but I do support the recommendations, and my position will be, my vote will be announced shortly, but I will vote in favor of the recommendation.
Thank you for your comments. Any other comments from the board? Mr. Romer?
It should be noted that I did all I could to help, because I didn't show up to a single meeting. And I think that facilitated good conversation, and I appreciate your work, Jay.
I'm speechless. I'm glad we could get to where we are. We have two public comment cards, one from Ms. Berrios and Ms. Moe, who was a faithful servant.
I'm not going to be long. I just wanted to add something that I'd forgotten this morning. When the Act 2 court case came down, vouchers were declared unconstitutionally if they were funded, unconstitutional, if they were funded through MFP, and arrangements were made to find another funding source for the vouchers. As Ms. Beebe said, I also believe that the MFP task force recommendation is a circumvention of that particular ruling. And if another funding source can be found for vouchers, I believe that another funding source could be found for course choice. I am not against courses that our children need in order to be successful in life be provided by our school system, and if that means a private provider, that's what it means. But I believe that another funding source would be the constitutional thing to do. So I would suggest that we look into a different funding source for course choice.
Thank you for your comments. Any further discussion? Any objection to the motion?
Object.
Ms. Hill objects. Next item is we need to take up the
Report?
the report.
I move approval of the report labeled House Resolution 148, Minimum Foundation Program Formula.
Thank you, Mr. Romer. Second.
Second it.
Ms. Bofi. Any discussion on this item? Any objection to the motion? Motion carries. That concludes, is that the conclusion? That concludes the Admin and Finance Committee meeting. And what's the next meeting?
SIT committee, they'll meet in 5 minutes.
5 minutes, 11:25.